Hi, my name is Annie Schuler. Welcome to my video course micro learning presentation. This presentation is based off of my book, Women of All Seasons, The Symbolism of the Menstrual Cycle, in which I talk about the four phases of the menstrual cycle. I talk about the biology of the menstrual cycle, but I also talk about the symbolism and the deeper meaning behind your menstrual cycle. And so that is what we are going to get into today. So I am so excited that you are joining me for this presentation. So this course is going to be about half an hour, 45 minutes. So grab a pen and paper and put away your distractions and join me for this course. I really want you to learn this information because I think it's so important to learn about our bodies as women and to also learn the deeper meaning that our bodies contain. So throughout this presentation, two things that I want you to take away. One, on a more practical level, is an easy way to remember your cycle. It's so important, as I said, to learn about our bodies, and so I want you to learn about your cycle but have an easy way to remember it so that you can keep it in your head on a daily basis. So that's one thing that I want you to take away from this. The second thing is how deeply you are designed by God. Our bodies have an amazing purpose, and then we also have a deep significance and layers of meaning wrapped around our bodies and our menstrual cycles. So, if nothing else, I want you to take away an easy way to remember your cycles and just an inner knowledge of the deep significance of your body. So, I'm so excited that you're joining me on this adventure. So, let's get into it. A little bit about me to get started. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. I went to college in Ohio, a small school called Franciscan University of Steubenville. I studied biology there, so I was learning all about anatomy and physiology of the human body and specifically the female body. And there was so much information that I was learning that I wanted to share with women and girls. And so eventually that's what led me to writing this book and to sharing this knowledge in this way. But right after college, I worked in labs. I have 5 years lab experience. And then in 2023, I got married, and now my husband and I have two kids. That's a little bit about me. Now I want to talk about you. So, as a woman, you are pinnacle, you are sacred, and you are whole. So, what does this mean? Well, to start with pinnacle, so going back all the way to the book of Genesis, we see how woman is pinnacle. So when you read the story of creation of the book of Genesis, this story is meant to convey spiritual truths. One of these truths is our dignity as women. And so when you look at the book of Genesis and the order at which things are created, it begins with the simple and goes to the complex. So it begins with time, light, materials of the world, plants, then animals, and then finally humans, humankind. And God creates man and then he creates woman. He creates woman to be a helper to the man because woman can do something that man cannot do. Woman can bring life into the world. And so then when you look at this arc of the story, it rises and rises and rises. And then after God creates woman, he rests. And so it's the resolution of the story. And so woman, as the channel of life, is set up as the climax of creation, and therefore she's the pinnacle of creation. So as this pinnacle of creation, a woman's body reflects creation. And so the seasons, as well as other parts of creation, are reflected in woman's body, specifically in the menstrual cycle. This cycle also reflects creation because we are the pinnacle of creation. And because of this, our bodies are sacred. Because we're the pinnacle of creation and because we're the channel of life, our bodies are sacred. And when something is sacred, we don't reveal it for all the world to see. We keep it hidden. And so we can see that in our bodies as well. Our wombs are in the center of our bodies. But in addition to that, ovulation in humans is called hidden ovulation. In other animals, there's a very visible sign when the females ovulate that tells the males to respond. But in humans, we don't have that. We have what's called a hidden ovulation. So this hiddenness of our wombs, the hiddenness of ovulation, in and of itself reveals its sacredness. And the last point is that we are whole. So, in a beautiful way, men and women are two halves of a whole. Our reproductive systems are two halves of a whole. We're complementary in this way. But the menstrual cycle, in and of itself, is whole. It's a cycle from beginning to end and back to beginning. And so it is whole in and of itself, and it is good for us in and of itself. Our hormones are good for us, but also the process that we go through our menstrual cycles, as you will see throughout this presentation, is good for us and can help us as a whole person. And so, because of all of this, as women, we are pinnacle, we are sacred, and we are whole. So that's getting into a little bit of the deeper meaning behind our body. And then just to back up, I do want to talk about the biology and the anatomy of our bodies, just so we're all on the same page. So to touch on this briefly, our womb, as I said, is at the center of our bodies. It's made up of the uterus, which is a muscular organ. It's kind of in the shape of an upside down pear. This muscular organ is hollow, and on the inside it's lined with the endometrium, or in other words, the endometrial lining. On the sides of the uterus are two branches called the fallopian tubes. These tubes lead to the ovaries, which are our gonads. They contain thousands of egg cells, which are our gametes, which is the genes that we pass on to our offspring. Then underneath our uterus comes down into a muscular channel called the cervix. And underneath the cervix is a more hollow channel called the vaginal canal. So some physical signs that we see throughout our menstrual cycles, we see every time we have our periods, we see the blood. We shed this nutrient-rich endometrial lining that is blood-like, and so it appears as blood. A lesser known physical sign is cervical mucus. So that muscular channel under the uterus is lined with epithelial cells, and these epithelial cells secrete a mucus. And this mucus actually changes throughout our cycle. And so we can observe this so that we can know where we are in our cycle. So it's two qualities of this mucus. We have E mucus, which is thin, watery, less acidic, and then we have G mucus, which is thick, sticky, acidic, and whitish, opaque. And so we'll get into that throughout the 4 phases of the cycle. We'll get into what type of mucus we're seeing when. Thirdly, our hormones. The hormones that I'm going to be talking about throughout this presentation are estrogen, progesterone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. Estrogen and progesterone are going to be coming from our ovaries, and follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are going to be coming from our brains and talking to our ovaries. So these hormones communicate through a pathway that's called the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. So your hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are going to secrete that FSH and LH, which communicates with your ovaries. Your ovaries are going to produce estrogen and progesterone, which again then speaks to your hypothalamus and pituitary gland in your brain. And so that is called the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. Lastly, your basal body temperature is also a sign that you can read throughout your cycle. When you are sleeping, your body comes down to its baseline temperature, so it's called the basal body temperature. And you can read this temperature as soon as you wake up. Your body's still at that baseline temperature. So as soon as you wake up in the morning and you take your temperature, that is your basal body temperature, and that is going to change throughout your cycle. And so that is one sign that you can read to know again where you are in your cycle. Okay, so moving on, we're going to, now that we covered the biology, we're going to look at the symbols that we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation. Okay, so now that we have the foundation of that biology, we're going to look at how the biology of our bodies is related to other things in creation. So we're going to look at the way that the 4 phases of our menstrual cycle is symbolized by the 4 seasons in the environment. We're going to look at the way the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle are symbolized by the 4 phases of the moon. We're also going to look at the way this menstrual cycle is symbolized by the four parts of the human person. So from a Thomistic perspective, the human person can be described as having four parts, namely the body, mind, spirit, and emotion. And so throughout our menstrual cycles, each part of our human person is emphasized. And so as we go through our menstrual cycles, this is how our cycles can help us grow and develop as a whole person. And lastly, we're going to be talking about 4 verses from the life of Mary of Nazareth and the way that she walks with us through our cycles. Okay, one last thing before we get into the 4 phases of the cycle, I just want to introduce these 2 ladies who I'm going to be referencing throughout the 4 phases of the cycle. Dr. Stacy Sims is an exercise physiologist, meaning she studies metabolism, specifically women's metabolism. And so throughout the 4 phases, I'm going to be referencing a health tip from her. Secondly, Sinu Joseph is a menstrual health educator from India, and her TED Talk, Unwrapping the Gifts of Menstruation, was really pivotal, really inspirational for me in writing this book. And so in that talk, she talks about a more ancient perspective on the menstrual cycle and how it was viewed as a very good thing. And so I'm going to be referencing what she says about each phase of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so now we're finally going to get into the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. All right, we're finally getting into it. The first phase of the menstrual cycle is your period. This is considered the first phase because it's the first phase that we start tracking. So the first day of your onset of bleeding is going to be the first day of your cycle. This is when we start tracking your cycle. So your period is when the uterus sheds that inner endometrial lining, and it's going to appear as blood. This season lasts about 5 to 9 days. And what else is going on during this season is that not much else is going on. So if you look at the diagram on the side of the slide, you see in the first column is your period. The first row of that first column is what is happening in your ovaries. That's the egg, the follicle, and the corpus luteum. The second row is your hormones. The third row is your basal body temperature. The row under that is that endometrial lining from a side view. So you're going to see its thickness is going to decrease. It's going to become thin as your uterus sheds that endometrial lining. And so while our wombs are shedding that endometrial lining, the egg cells in our ovaries are small, they're dormant, they're called primary follicles. Our hormones are low, and then that means our basal body temperature is also going to be low during this season. And so exercise physiologist Dr. Stacy Sims recommends increasing iron intake during this season to supplement for that blood loss. She also recommends taking antioxidants during this season. So that's going to be found in berries like blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, as well as dark leafy greens. So what causes your uterus to shed that endometrial lining is the muscles of your uterus are going to contract, and that's going to slough off that endometrial lining. Your muscles contract because of the presence of prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are a hormone-like substance that cause muscle contractions. So as your body releases prostaglandins to get that uterus to shed its endometrial lining, the prostaglandins can go a little crazy and affect other organs. So you may have intestinal discomfort during this season. Antioxidants actually mitigate those prostaglandins. So if you're increasing your intake of antioxidants during this season, you can help with that discomfort that's caused by those extra prostaglandins. And so that can ease some of this discomfort during this season. Okay, so now looking at the symbolism. So because of the shedding of the endometrial lining, the low hormones and low basal body temperature, this season of your period is represented by autumn. So the falling red blood is symbolized by the falling red leaves during the season of autumn in the environment. Autumn is also a time when the temperatures outside begin to decrease, and so that is represented in our low hormones and low basal body temperature. This season is also symbolized by the body. So during your period, you're very grounded in your body. You may be experiencing these uncomfortable symptoms, these very physical symptoms of shedding red blood, of having uncomfortable cramps. And so we're very much grounded in our bodies during this season, and the shedding of the blood also can remind us of our mortality during this season. So Senior Joseph, mental health educator, says that from an ancient perspective, your period was actually a time of cleansing and removal of negativity. And so while your body is cleansing what it no longer needs, you can lean into this time and cleanse your heart of what it no longer needs during this season. So looking at the life of Mary, this is why this season is symbolized by the verse that says, when the days were completed for her purification, they took him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. So Mary's purification references the Jewish tradition around menstruation called nidah. And so this emphasizes that the time of your period is a time of purification. So while your body is cleansing itself, what it no longer needs, again, this is a time for purification and for cleansing for your whole person. And so this time is also symbolized by the new moon. It's when the moon is completely covered by the shadow of the earth. It is dark. And again, it's that clearing of the slate, restarting and refresh, and a time of renewal. And so that is the first season. So now let's move on to the second season of your menstrual cycle. The second phase of your menstrual cycle is called the follicular phase. So looking at the chart, you see in that first row, this is what's going on in your ovaries. Your ovaries are filled with thousands of egg cells, and every egg cell is contained in a bubble called a follicle. And so that is where we get the term follicular phase. So during the season of the follicular phase, these follicles are maturing, they're getting bigger, and they're competing with all of the other follicles around them. So the follicle that at the end of the follicular phase, whichever one is the biggest and the best, is able to release its egg during the next season of ovulation, which we will get to. But so that is the follicular phase, the growth of this follicle. And this phase is actually variable in length because it all depends on how long it takes your ovaries to grow these follicles. So this can actually be affected by your environment. This can be affected by stress specifically. And so when you're in a stressful environment, your body is going to conserve its resources, and it is not going to put effort into producing an egg and having a potential pregnancy, which takes a lot more resources. So that is why for some women, this season can be affected by stress in the environment, and by lack of nutrition in their bodies. So also what is going on during this season is that our hormones are low, and again, our basal body temperature is low. So our basal body temperature is always going to follow our hormones. When our hormones, estrogen, progesterone, are low, our basal body temperature is also going to be low. So Dr. Stacey Sims says that during this season, when our hormones and that basal body temperature are low, this is going to give our brains and our nervous tissue a little bit more space to work efficiently. So this is going to give us better hand-eye coordination. This is going to give us the technical sides of our brain a little bit more space to work efficiently, to work clearly. And so we're going to have a more clarity of mind during this season as well. So all of that is why this season of the follicular phase is symbolized by winter. So because of the growth of that follicle is happening in our ovaries and our hormones are low and our basal body temperature is low, this is kind of a hidden growth that's happening because we don't have a physical sign that is telling us that this is happening per se. And so that is like winter when there's hidden growth underneath the snow that is preparing for spring, but during winter we don't see that growth. We see the silence of the snowy nights. And because of that low hormone and low basal body temperature, that is going to be reflected in the cold temperatures of winter. Also, I forgot to put it on the slide, our cervical mucus during this season is going to be that G mucus. So that's going to be that thick white cervical mucus that is reflected in the snow during winter. And so because of our low hormones, this season is going to be symbolized by the mind because we have a better mental clarity during this season. We don't have these hormones that are raging. We don't have a heightened basal body temperature. And so again, this is going to give our nervous tissue space to function most efficiently. And so we are going to have this clarity of mind that we experience during this season. So that's why this season is symbolized by the mind. C.N. Joseph says from an ancient perspective, they considered this season to be when women were at their most energetic. So this is when women were at their most creative and they could begin and work on creative projects. And so we see that as this inner creativity is happening, as the follicles are growing in our ovaries, we experience a creativity and an energy ourselves throughout the season. And so that is why this season is symbolized by the verse from Mary's life that says, Mary set out and traveled to the hill country in haste. And so when Mary heard that her cousin Elizabeth was with child, she responded with generosity and she responded quickly and efficiently. And so, again, she is during this season when we have this efficiency and clarity of mind, we can look at Mary, who is also responding in her life with clarity of purpose and an efficiency. She goes and helps her cousin Elizabeth unhesitatingly and with purpose. And so this season is also symbolized by the waxing moon. So that is when the image of the moon is growing in the sky, the Earth's shadow is uncovering it, and that is mirrored in the follicles that are growing in our ovaries. Great, so moving on to the third season in our menstrual cycles, this is ovulation. So ovulation is actually more so considered an event by the medical community. It is not so much a phase because it is that single event when an egg is released from the follicle. But I do call it a season for my purposes, obviously, but then also the effects of the hormones can last several days. But ovulation is this single event when the egg is released from the ovary, from the follicle in the ovary. And the egg is only viable for 24 hours, and the effects of the hormones can last a few days. So as that egg is released from the ovary, this is accompanied by a spike in estrogen as well as a spike in follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So the estrogen is going to communicate with the brain, and then the brain is going to communicate back with FSH and LH and tell that ovary to release its egg. And so our basal body temperature is then also going to increase because our hormones are increasing. Our basal body temperature is also going to increase during this season. So it's not going to be by much. It's going to be by about half a degree. But if you are tracking your basal body temperature regularly, you will be able to see this increase on your chart. So estrogen is a very powerful hormone. Estrogen is good for our bone health, our heart health, and our brain health. Estrogen actually increases the connections in our brain. And so during this season, when we have a spike in estrogen, we are going to see an increase in brain connections during this season. One of the other things that estrogen does is that it thins out our cervical mucus. So our cervical mucus, which had been sticky and white, is now going to become thin and clear and watery. And so if you're observing your cervical mucus on a regular basis, that is the change in the cervical mucus that you can see during this time. If depending on the structure of your cervix specifically, and the quantity of epithelial cells that line your cervix and the location, you may or may not see cervical mucus throughout your whole cycle. If you don't see cervical mucus throughout your whole cycle, you are most likely going to see cervical mucus only during this time when it is most thin and watery. And so when you see that presence of the cervical mucus, you know that it is this season when you are ovulating. If you see cervical mucus throughout your cycle, what you're going to want to look for is that change in the cervical mucus from that white, sticky to this more clear and watery. So Dr. Stacy Sims, physiologist, recommends that we increase our carbohydrate intake during this season. So she recommends increasing it by, for example, a handful of potato chips or a small peanut butter and bread sandwich. She does not recommend eating an entire bag of potato chips, unfortunately. She says a small handful of potato chips are going to be all the extra carbohydrates that you need during this season because estrogen, as well as progesterone, the backbone of that molecular structure is made up of carbohydrates. And so increasing our carbohydrate during this time is going to support that hormone production. Okay, so moving on from the biology, we're going to look at the symbolism for this season. So because of all of these symptoms, uh, ovulation is symbolized by the season of spring. So spring is when the flowers are blooming, birds are singing, the bees are buzzing. This is a time of energy and life. And so that is what is happening in our bodies, and that is why this is reflected in spring. So this egg releasing from our ovaries is like the flowers blooming. Our high hormones and our high basal body temperature is going to be reflected in the increasing temperatures during spring in the environment. It's finally warming up after long cold winters. And as well, the watery cervical mucus is going to be reflected in the rain that we often see during spring. And so this season is also going to be symbolized by the part of the human person, namely the spirit. So because estrogen is coursing through our bodies during this season, this gives us feelings of openness and receptivity and life. Because as estrogen is coursing through our bodies during this season, this is giving us feelings of openness and receptivity and connection. And so that is why this season is symbolized by the part of the human person, namely the spirit, because this openness and receptivity can give us an openness towards God. And so we can really lean into our prayer life during this season. We can really build that relationship with our Creator. And so St. Joseph says, from an ancient perspective, this was the time when women looked and felt more attractive. And so this was a time when they were more vulnerable and had more of a desire to connect with others. And so that is what we experience during this season because of that estrogen. And so that is why this season is symbolized by the verse from Mary's life that says, "May it be done unto me according to thy word." So when the angel Gabriel came to Mary and asked her to be the mother of Christ, she said yes with openness and receptivity. And she opened up her body to be a temple of the Lord. And so we can imitate her during this season by leaning into this openness, leaning into this vulnerability and this need to connect with others. This is not just with the opposite sex. This is a great time for get-togethers with our girlfriends, just spending time with our loved ones. And so then finishing off with the symbolism of the moon. This season is symbolized by the full moon. So the full moon is when the moon is completely bright. It is at its brightest and liveliest. And so that is reflected when we are at our liveliest and most energetic during this season of ovulation. All right, we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for this presentation. The last phase of our menstrual cycle is called the luteal phase. This is so called because in our ovaries, once that follicle has released its egg, the follicle is actually made up of cells itself. And so once it is empty, the follicle begins degenerating into, and it's called the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is Latin for yellow body. So when you look at the structure under a microscope, it has a yellowish appearance. And so that's why in Latin it's called yellow body. And so that's where we get the term luteal phase from that corpus luteum. And so as this corpus luteum is degenerating, that's going to take about 10 to 14 days. So this is the longest phase of our cycle, and it's going to remain rather consistent. So unlike the follicular phase, which was variable based on your body, based on stress in your environment, the luteal phase, however, is going to be consistent. So once you begin tracking and you determine the length of your luteal phase, that is going to remain rather consistent for you. So during this phase, the corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone in high quantities, and so this is going to be a high hormone phase. And again, as I said, our basal body temperature follows the pattern of our hormones, and so our basal body temperature is also going to be high during this season. So estrogen and progesterone are, as I said, very powerful hormones. Some of the things that progesterone does is that it's going to promote the rebuilding of your endometrial lining. It's also going to thicken your cervical mucus. So that cervical mucus that was thinned out by the estrogen during ovulation is going to thicken again because of the presence of that progesterone. And so again, that hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis is going to be communicating during this season. Estrogen and progesterone coming from your ovaries is going to communicate with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in your brain. And so progesterone is going to have a great effect on your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus not only communicates with your ovaries, but it's also the center for emotional control. It's also the center for hunger and fatigue and maternal affection. And so during this season, all of these things are going to be heightened. Your hunger is going to increase, your fatigue is going to increase, as well as your emotions and your maternal affection. These are going to increase during this season. All of this is because of progesterone. It's affecting that hypothalamus, but it is also rebuilding the endometrial lining, and that is going to use up a lot of calories, and it causes us to crave more calories and more sleep during this season. And so all of this is to make our bodies a more nurturing place. Our emotions are going to increase and our maternal affection is going to increase. And so our whole person, body and emotion, is going to become more nurturing during this season. And so Dr. Stacy Sims recommends that we intake more protein and nitric oxide during this season. So the progesterone can have these effects of that hunger and fatigue and emotion. And we can also possibly be feeling bloated, and we could be feeling a lot of lethargy during this season. And so to mitigate that, Dr. Stacy Sims recommends increasing your protein and your nitric oxide. So nitrous oxide is laughing gas, and that is not what this is. This is nitric oxide. This is a compound that's found in fruits and vegetables, for example, pomegranates and watermelon, as well as dark leafy greens. And so both of these are going to help mitigate some of those negative effects of that progesterone, namely that bloating and the lethargy that we may experience during this season. So all of this is why this season is symbolized by summer, because as our bodies are becoming a more nurturing place with that thickened endometrial lining and the presence of the hormones and the high emotions, that is symbolized in the fertile soil of summer. So during summer is when the farmers are planting, the harvest is coming in, just the environment is full of bustling life of plants and animals. Also, our high hormones and the high basal body temperature is going to be reflected in the hot sun and the high temperatures during summer. So this season is also symbolized by the part of the human person, namely emotion. So as I said, progesterone is going to be affecting the hypothalamus, which is the center of emotional control and maternal affection. And so during this season, we are going to feel more emotional. And this is really meant to make us more nurturing. But this can also make us more emotional in a negative sense. And so Sinu Joseph says that these days we really dismiss this season as PMS and a time of just uncontrollable mood swings, whereas from an ancient perspective, they consider this time to be a highly intuitive phase. And so these emotions that women were experiencing were because their brains were picking up on making connections that they wouldn't otherwise be making. And so we're having these thoughts and these feelings that we don't otherwise have. And so instead of considering all of this to be a negative thing, this can actually be a highly intuitive phase for us during this season. This can become an intuitive phase when we look at the life of Mary. So when after the birth of Christ, Mary, it says that Mary kept all of these things, reflecting on them in her heart. And so when all of the crazy events were happening surrounding the conception and birth of her son, Christ, Mary didn't get confused, she didn't get frustrated, she didn't get overwhelmed. She took all of these things and she reflected on them in her heart. And so when we imitate her during this season, we can take all of these emotions and all of these thoughts and feelings that we're having that may seem out of control. When we take all of them and reflect on them and contemplate, then we can come to a level of deeper understanding during this season. And so to finish off with the symbolism of the moon, this season is symbolized by the waning moon, when the image of the moon in the sky is getting smaller and smaller. And that is going to be mirrored in that corpus luteum that is degenerating in our ovaries. And so it too is getting smaller and smaller. And so as that corpus luteum degenerates, it is going to stop producing progesterone. So our progesterone is going to run out. And once our estrogen and progesterone run out, that is going to cause our hypothalamus to then tell our wombs to shed that endometrial lining. And we're going to go back to the first phase of our menstrual cycle, which is our periods. In actuality, our periods are the end of our cycle. As we go through puberty, we actually begin in the follicular phase. So before puberty, all of our egg cells in those follicles are in their primary dormant state. And then as we go through puberty, our follicles begin maturing. And once that one follicle is mature, it is released from the ovary. We ovulate for the first time. And then we go through the luteal phase and our bodies become a more nurturing place. But then when there is no pregnancy and our hormones run out, our bodies shed that endometrial lining for the very first time and we receive our first period. So our periods, in a beautiful way, are the beginning as well as the end of our cycles. Our periods are the end because they are the end of that very first cycle. But our periods are the beginning because that is when we start tracking, because our periods are the most obvious sign in our cycle, and so it is easy to begin tracking on that day. And so that is why the season is symbolized by autumn, because autumn is also the beginning as well as the end of the year in the environment. It is the end because it is the falling of the leaves, but autumn is also, I feel, a time of new beginnings. And so, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, one of the things that I want you to take away is an easy way to remember your cycle. And that is through the symbolism of the seasons. So your period is symbolized by autumn because the falling red leaves represent the falling red blood. The follicular phase is symbolized by winter because the cold temperatures during winter are reflected in that low hormone, low basal body temperature in your bodies. Ovulation is symbolized by spring because when the ovary releases that egg, it is like the blooming flowers during spring, and the clear cervical mucus is like the rain during spring. The luteal phase is symbolized by summer because the high hormones and high basal body temperature are mirrored in the hot temperatures during summer. And so I truly hope that this gives you an easy way to remember your menstrual cycles and so that you can know where you are in your cycles and you can have a better understanding of your body. And on a deeper level, I hope that this has given you a greater appreciation for the amazing wonder that your body is. So I hope that you now know how the menstrual cycle can help you grow as a whole person, and that through each phase of your menstrual cycle, you can lean into the different aspect of you as a person, and you can learn and grow through this monthly process that we go through as women. And so thank you so much for joining me for this video course presentation. And I hope that you agree with me, as well as Catholic philosopher Alice von Hildebrand, who says, indeed, it is a privilege to be a woman. I truly believe this, and I truly believe that this symbolism can help you understand your cycles and help you grow as a woman throughout your cycles. So thank you so much, and don't forget to check out my book on Amazon, Women of All Seasons, The Symbolism of the Menstrual Cycle. So thank you so much.